In a galaxy of 600 alien civilizations, one species had just been called prey to their face in front of everyone. It happened in the assembly chamber of a station called Helios Concord, and the word was spoken so calmly, so cleanly, that the translation system carried it into every language in the room without distortion. It did not need distortion. It was already precise. Before that moment, before the word and the silence that followed it, there was the station itself. Helios Concord circled a small white star in a quiet corner of the Orion Arm, turning slowly in the dark like a great ring of silver fire. From a distance it looked simple, almost elegant. Up close, it was enormous. The outer hull stretched nearly 2,000 kilometers across, wide enough that entire ecosystems existed inside its rotating structure. The corridors of the outer ring were large enough for creatures the size of small mountains. The inner sectors were divided into atmospheric zones carefully engineered for hundreds of different biological needs. Methane chambers, liquid ammonia environments, low-gravity halls, dense oxygen forests. The architects who had built Helios Concord 3 centuries earlier had done so with one goal. Every intelligent species in the known galaxy needed to be able to stand in the same room without dying. For most of the galaxy's history, that had been impossible. Wars between alien civilizations had been brutal and decisive. Species had risen, expanded, and vanished long before anyone had developed the idea that perhaps the stars did not have to belong to the strongest alone. The Concord had changed that. 312 species had signed the original charter. 312 governments had agreed that the star beneath the station would belong to no one. Neutral ground, neutral law, neutral council. In theory. In practice, power always found a way to arrange itself. Inside the Concord's central chamber, where the Great Assembly met, the seating arrangement told the real story of the galaxy. The chamber was shaped like a massive bowl. At the very center stood the speaker's platform, a simple circular structure designed to translate voice, light, scent, and chemical signals into every language used by the Concord's member species. Around it rose hundreds of delegation tiers. The most powerful species sat closest to the center. The smaller powers sat farther back. The weakest watched from the edges. No one had officially designed the chamber that way, but that was how it had settled over the decades. Because some civilizations mattered more than others, and rooms, given enough time, tend to reflect that truth. At the center tier, directly across from the speaker's platform, sat the delegation of the Vorkai Dominion. Even among hundreds of alien species, the Vorkai were difficult to ignore. They stood nearly 3 meters tall on their primary limbs, their bodies supported by a powerful skeletal structure that gave them a broad, predatory posture. Their skin looked like dark volcanic stone, ridged and plated from millions of years of evolution on a violent high-gravity world. 8 limbs, used for movement, for manipulation. Their eyes were a deep metallic gold, positioned wide across their heads to track movement across long distances. Evolution had built them for hunting. History had turned them into conquerors. The Vorkai Dominion controlled 43 star systems. None of them had been acquired peacefully. Across the last 6 centuries, the Vorkai had fought 32 recorded wars against neighboring civilizations. They had lost none of them. Entire species had been absorbed into the Dominion after those conflicts. Their governments dissolved, their fleets incorporated into Vorkai command structures, their cultures allowed to exist only within the boundaries the Dominion permitted. The Concord referred to those species politely as associated members. The phrase sounded diplomatic. Everyone understood what it meant. Subjects. Still, the Vorkai attended every assembly session. They followed Concord law. They voted in council matters. They spoke about cooperation and stability in the calm, measured tones expected of any civilized government. And no one in the chamber forgot that the largest military force in known space sat quietly behind those words. The Vorkai delegation today numbered 11 representatives. They occupied their seats in the central tier with the easy confidence of beings who had never been seriously challenged in living memory. Around them, the other major powers arranged themselves in careful proximity. The Cerati Collective, the Thelene Republic, the Meath Engineering Union. Dozens of smaller civilizations filled the outer tiers in increasingly distant circles. Each species carried its own history, its own fears, its own quiet calculations about who in the chamber it could afford to anger and who it could not. From the highest observation balconies, the chamber looked like a living map of the galaxy's political gravity. And gravity, like always, pulled everything toward the Vorkai. For 600 years, that had been the way of things. Empires rose. Empires fell. But the Vorkai dominion endured. No fleet had ever defeated them in open battle. No rebellion had ever broken free from their control once they had taken a system. They were not cruel rulers by the standards of conquest. They were efficient ones. They taxed the worlds they held. They enforced their laws. They tolerated local cultures so long as those cultures never threatened dominion authority. It was a stable system. Predictable. Many species in the Concord had quietly accepted that stability as the natural order of the galaxy. And perhaps it would have remained that way for centuries longer, if not for the newest delegation in the chamber. 3 tiers from the outer edge. A small group of representatives from a species that had joined the Concord only 3 years earlier. A species that controlled exactly one major inhabited world. A species whose interstellar history was so short that many of the older civilizations in the chamber barely considered them relevant. They called themselves humans. Most of the galaxy had not yet decided whether they mattered. But the Concord had learned something over the centuries. History rarely announced its turning points in advance. Sometimes they arrived quietly. Sometimes they took a seat near the edge of the room and waited. Humanity had been a member of the Concord for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. By galactic standards, that was not long enough to matter. Many species in the chamber had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. Their civilizations had risen, fractured, rebuilt themselves, and expanded again across entire sectors of the galaxy long before the first human satellite had left Earth's atmosphere. Humans had arrived late. Very late. Their home system contained only one fully developed inhabited world and a handful of smaller colonies scattered across nearby planets and orbital habitats. Their fleet was modest. Their political structure was complicated. Their history, according to the files most Concord analysts had read, was messy. Wars, revolutions, shifting alliances, civilizations collapsing and rebuilding again and again. Compared to the great powers of the Concord, humanity looked small, unstable, young, which was why their delegation seats had been placed near the outer tiers of the chamber, not as an insult, just as a practical recognition of their current importance, or lack of it. The human delegation today consisted of 4 representatives, 3 advisors, and 1 ambassador. Ambassador Elena Voss had arrived at the Concord station shortly after humanity's admission into the council. She was tall by human standards, though that did not mean much in a room filled with species that ranged from insect-sized diplomats to beings the size of armored vehicles. Her hair was dark. Her posture was straight. Her expression, most of the time, was calm enough that several alien diplomats had described her as difficult to read. She had spent 24 years in human diplomatic service before being assigned to the Concord. She spoke 7 human languages. She had learned 2 alien ones. And she had spent the last 3 years doing something that few people in the chamber noticed. Watching. The Concord chamber was a useful place for observation. Species that would never speak openly in public spaces often revealed quite a lot in the quiet movements of a council meeting. Who sat closer together? Who avoided eye contact? Who voted immediately? Who hesitated? Patterns appeared quickly if you were patient enough to look for them. Voss had become very patient. Beside her, one of her advisors leaned slightly closer and spoke in a quiet voice. Another trade corridor dispute. 3rd one this week. Voss nodded once. The Concord had many official responsibilities. Trade regulation, navigation agreements, interstellar communication standards. But most sessions eventually circled around the same underlying problem. Power. Who had it? Who didn't? And how much of it the smaller species were willing to challenge. The Vorkai delegation rarely spoke first in these debates. They did not need to. Other civilizations usually adjusted their proposals long before anything reached the point of open disagreement. No one wanted to start a confrontation they knew they could not win. Voss had noticed that pattern within her first few weeks on the station. She had also noticed something else. The species most frequently overruled in Concord negotiations were almost always the same ones. The associated members. The civilizations whose governments existed under Vorkai oversight. They attended the assemblies. They cast votes. They spoke when called upon. But they never voted against the Dominion. Not once. 3 years of session records confirmed it. Across the chamber, one of those associated delegates was speaking now. A small gray diplomat from the Falari Cooperative, their narrow body wrapped in ceremonial metallic cloth that glimmered softly under the chamber lights. Their voice translated through the Concord system as calm and respectful. Our request concerns medical technology exchange protocols, the Falari representative said. Several of our planetary hospitals would benefit significantly from expanded access to. The delegate stopped speaking, not because the translation system had failed, because one of the Vorkai had moved. One of the Dominion representatives had leaned slightly forward in their seat. Just a movement. Nothing aggressive. Nothing dramatic. But the Falari diplomat saw it. The request ended 2 sentences later. Reduced. Softened. Adjusted until it no longer risked inconveniencing the Dominion's priorities. The vote passed quietly. Boss made a note on her tablet. Her advisor noticed. What did you write? She answered without looking up. Fear is efficient. He studied the chamber again. You think that's what this is? Voss closed the tablet. Yes, she said simply. Around them the session continued. Trade routes. Resource allocation. Border clarifications. Routine business conducted with the careful politeness of civilizations that had learned how dangerous open conflict could be. From the outside, the Concord looked like a functioning galactic government. From the inside, it often felt more like a room where smaller powers negotiated carefully around a single massive gravity well. And humanity, for the moment, barely registered on that map. The session had been running for nearly 2 hours when the agenda reached its final item. New member address. It was an old Concord tradition. Whenever a civilization joined the council, they were given the opportunity to formally introduce themselves to the rest of the galaxy. Not immediately, new species were usually expected to spend a few years observing first, learning the structure of Concord politics before stepping into the center of the chamber. Humanity's address had already been delayed twice due to scheduling conflicts and more urgent matters of trade and border negotiations. Today, finally, the moment had arrived. The chamber lights shifted slightly as the speaker platform activated. The Concord moderator turned toward the outer tiers. The assembly now recognizes the human delegation. Ambassador Elena Voss, you have the floor. Several hundred pairs of eyes turned toward the human section. Compound, luminous, faceted, mechanical, all of them finding the small delegation near the back of the room. Voss stood. She adjusted the sleeves of her jacket with a small, practiced motion and walked down the long curved pathway that led toward the center of the chamber. The walk took nearly a minute. The Concord was designed that way. Every species that spoke before the council was meant to feel the weight of the room. The history, the gravity of a place where decisions affecting hundreds of worlds were made. Voss had prepared her speech carefully. She had rehearsed it dozens of times over the last month. It was a simple introduction, who humanity was, where they had come from, what they hoped to contribute to the Concord. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational. Humans were new here. New species were expected to be polite, respectful, patient. She stepped onto the circular platform and placed her hands lightly on the edge of the console. The translation system activated. Her voice echoed clearly through the chamber. Honored delegates, humanity is grateful for the opportunity to stand before this assembly today. Point of order. The words were deep enough that the translation system vibrated slightly when it carried them across the chamber. Every head in the room turned. The voice had come from the central tier, from the Vorkai delegation. One of the Dominion representatives was standing. He was the oldest among them, the ridges along his dark armored skin deeper than the others, the gold of his eyes carrying the particular quality of something that had seen a great many rooms and found all of them familiar. His name was Vraxen. For 30 years he had been the Vorkai Dominion's primary representative to the Concord. When Vraxen spoke, the room listened. He stepped down from his delegation seat and walked toward the center floor, his heavy limbs moving with the deliberate calm of a being that had never needed to hurry. The chamber grew quiet. Not comfortable quiet, the kind of silence that spreads when everyone knows something unusual is about to happen and no one is sure yet how unusual it will be. Vraxen stopped a few meters from the speaker platform and looked down at Voss. Ambassador, he said, the Dominion has a procedural concern. The moderator hesitated briefly. State your concern. Vraxin turned slowly so that his golden eyes swept across the entire assembly chamber. We wish to address the matter of humanity's presence in this council. A low ripple moved through the room. Not protest, more like nervous shifting, the sound of hundreds of beings recalibrating how carefully they needed to sit. Voss stood still. Her expression had not changed. Humanity is a very young species, Vraxin continued. Recently arrived in interstellar affairs. Your civilization controls one primary world, a handful of small colonies. Your military capacity is, he paused, letting the silence do the work. The word would finish, modest. The translation system rendered the final word with careful neutrality. His tone made its meaning clear anyway. Several members of the Dominion have therefore questioned the appropriateness of granting such a species a full voice in this assembly. The Concord makes decisions that affect trillions of lives. Empires, economies, entire civilizations. He turned his gaze back to Voss. To allow a species that has barely left its own solar system to participate equally in such decisions. He paused. Cheapens the institution. The chamber had gone completely silent. A few delegates looked down at their consoles. Others watched in uncomfortable stillness. The Falari diplomat who had spoken earlier had not moved since Vraxin began. In the associated member tiers, the civilizations whose governments existed under Dominion authority, who had learned over decades exactly what stillness was required of them in moments like this. No one made a sound. No one looked up. Vraxin took another slow step forward. His massive hand reached toward the human delegation bench beside the speaker platform. There sat the small communications terminal assigned to the human representatives. Standard Concord equipment, used for recording votes and transmitting official messages. He lifted it. The device looked almost fragile in his enormous hand. He studied it for a moment with the mild interest of someone examining something that had briefly caught their attention. Then he crushed it. Metal bent with a sharp crack. The screen shattered. Fragments fell onto the floor of the chamber. The sound echoed across the silent room. Vraxin placed the broken pieces back on the bench. He looked at Voss again. Pray, he said calmly. The word translated perfectly into every language in the chamber. It did not need inflection. It did not need context. 6 centuries of military dominance had given that word its own weight, and the room felt it. Does not negotiate. For several seconds, no one moved. Hundreds of species sat frozen in their seats. Some looked away. Some watched with fascination. Most simply remained still in the particular way of beings who have spent their lives learning that stillness is the correct response when power is being demonstrated nearby. The Falari delegate had folded their hands in their lap and was studying the floor. 2 representatives from associated member states had turned off their translation receivers. A small diplomat near the far outer tier had stood halfway from their seat and then, visibly, decided not to. No one spoke. Ambassador Elena Voss looked down at the broken terminal on the bench beside her. The pieces lay scattered across the surface. The screen split cleanly, the casing bent outward, small components rolling slowly toward the edge. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she looked back up at Vraxin. Her eyes were very still. There was no anger in them. No fear. Something quieter than either. A quality of attention, of having spent 3 years watching this room and finally seeing what she had been watching for made plainly, undeniably visible. She straightened her jacket slowly and leaned slightly toward the microphone. I would like to thank the Vorkai delegation, she said clearly. Her voice did not rise. It carried across the chamber the same way it always had, without effort, without performance. For making this moment so easy to remember. The room remained silent. My prepared remarks no longer seem necessary, she continued. I believe the assembly has just learned everything it needs to know. She looked slowly around the chamber. Not quickly, taking her time, meeting the gaze of delegation after delegation. The associated members who had cast 3 years of votes they hadn't chosen. The larger powers who had found reasons to study their consoles. The neutral civilizations who had said nothing and were still saying nothing. She met their eyes. She let them know she had counted them. To every species watching, she said, we see you. We see how many of you said nothing. A pause. And we understand why. Her gaze returned to Vraxin. What just happened, she said quietly, is the last mistake the Dominion will ever make with impunity. She stepped away from the platform, walked back up the long curved path, returned to the human delegation seats, and began writing a message. 3 words long. Prepare for war. The message reached Earth 9 minutes after Ambassador Voss sent it. 9 minutes. That was the time required for the Concorde Relay Network to move information across the interstellar communication grid and deliver it to the human diplomatic command center orbiting the moon. The message itself contained only a few lines. A complete recording of the assembly session, a formal report describing the incident, and the recommendation. Prepare for war. No one in the command center asked whether the report was accurate. The video spoke for itself. They watched the recording twice. The moment where Vraxin crushed the terminal was replayed several more times. The word "pray" echoed through the quiet room each time the footage reached that point. No one laughed. No one raised their voice. The people present in that room were not politicians. They were analysts, diplomats, and military advisors who had spent their careers studying interstellar conflict. They understood exactly what had happened. A major power had publicly declared humanity insignificant. That kind of declaration had consequences. Within 2 hours, the message had reached Earth itself. Within 4 hours, it had reached every major human government. Within 12 hours, a secure conference call connected the leaders of 23 nations and the commanders of humanity's unified space defense fleets. The meeting lasted 26 minutes. The vote took 9 seconds. It was unanimous. Historians would later describe that vote with a certain amount of disbelief. Humanity had spent thousands of years arguing with itself about everything. Borders, religion, resources, politics. There were entire wars in human history that had begun over disagreements about trade taxes. And yet when the recording from the Concorde chamber finished playing, none of those old arguments appeared. No one suggested caution. No one proposed compromise. No one asked whether humanity might simply ignore the insult and move on. Instead, the leaders of Earth listened to the word "pray" spoken across the stars. And something old in the species responded, a quiet understanding that passed through the meeting like a current, the kind that does not require explanation because it has been present for a very long time, waiting for the right moment to surface. The decision was simple. Humanity would prepare. The news spread quickly across human space, across Earth's continents, across the orbital cities circling the planet, across the 42 colony worlds scattered across nearby star systems. The reactions varied in detail, but the emotion behind them was remarkably similar. There was anger, of course, but anger was not the dominant response. The dominant response was something calmer, a kind of collective settling, like the moment when someone who has been patient for a very long time finally stands up from their chair. Factories operating on normal schedules began extending their shifts. Shipyards in orbit around Mars increased production quotas. Mining colonies accelerated their resource shipments. Military recruitment offices reported the highest enlistment numbers in human history within 3 days. No emergency declaration had been issued yet. No formal war announcement had been made. But humanity had already begun moving. On a mining station orbiting the dwarf planet Sedna, in the outermost reaches of the solar system, the news arrived 2 days after the Concorde incident. Communication delays stretched that far out. The station's population of 216 workers gathered in the common hall and watched the recording together. Among them was a drilling engineer named Kira Solis, who had spent 11 years on Sedna extracting ice and rare metals from frozen asteroids and had not thought about interstellar politics in most of that time. She watched the footage the way she watched everything, quietly, from the back of the room, waiting until she understood what she was seeing before she decided how to feel about it. When the recording ended, she sat with it for a moment. Around her, 200 colleagues were doing the same. Then she stood up slowly from her chair. "Well," she said. She looked around the room. Her colleagues looked back. "Guess we're building ships now." The room nodded. No debate. No committee. No formal vote. Just a room full of people who had heard something and understood what it meant and had already decided what came next before anyone said a word. Across human space, similar conversations were happening. Short, practical, decisive. A colony called New Carthage sent a message to Earth 6 hours after receiving the news. Trade disputes suspended. We stand with you. An orbital habitat called Jericho Station, which had been pushing for full political independence from Earth for 3 years, responded 12 hours later. Independence referendum postponed. Send us weapons and instructions. Even the smallest settlements found their voices. Halo Point, a mining colony so distant that communication delays stretched across hours, transmitted a single sentence 2 days later. We heard what happened. All 40,000 of us are in. The effect was unprecedented. Human history had never recorded a moment when every colony, every government, and every military command structure aligned so quickly. The species that had spent most of its existence arguing with itself had become, in the span of days, something it had almost never been. Unified. The first emergency session of the Joint Command War Council took place 12 hours after the Concorde recording reached Earth. The meeting was held in a facility deep beneath the Alps, in a complex that had once belonged to a different era of human conflict. The building above ground was small and unremarkable. The real structure existed far below. Inside the conference room sat the senior commanders of humanity's combined space fleet, the directors of the largest shipbuilding corporations, economic advisors, and the heads of the interplanetary defense networks. At the head of the table sat General Idris Okafor, who had commanded the unified Earth fleet for 6 years. Before that, he had spent most of his career in smaller regional conflicts between human colonies, wars that most alien civilizations would have considered minor border disputes. Humans had called them something else. Experience. The Concorde recording played once at the beginning of the meeting. No one spoke during it. When the screen went dark, Admiral Chen Xiaoyan stood and activated the tactical display hovering above the center of the table. Current human fleet strength, she said calmly. 418 operational warships across all classes. 18 orbital defense platforms. Approximately 43 million trained ground personnel across Earth and colonial systems. She paused. Then she changed the display. The Vorkai Dominion appeared. Their numbers were much larger, the kind of numbers that made the human total look like a rounding error on a spreadsheet. 6 centuries of conquest had built a military apparatus that dwarfed anything humanity had yet assembled. The room absorbed the comparison quietly. On paper, the outcome of a war between the two civilizations was not complicated. Humanity was outmatched. Significantly, Admiral Chen closed the tactical display and folded her hands behind her back. "Those are the numbers," she said. General Okafor nodded slowly. "Tell me what the numbers don't say." Several officers glanced at one another. Chen almost smiled. "That the Vorkai have never fought a long war." The display shifted again. This time the timeline stretched back 10,000 years, and human history filled the air above the table. Conflicts appeared one after another. The Punic Wars, the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic campaigns, the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War, colonial conflicts, planetary civil wars, interplanetary independence revolutions, war after war after war, stretching back across centuries into the deep record of a species that had never stopped fighting itself long enough to forget how. The timeline was messy, chaotic, filled with red marks representing violence and destruction in quantities that would have been unimaginable to most galactic civilizations. It did not look like the military history of a species that should have survived long enough to reach the stars. Chen gestured toward the display. The Vorkai win wars quickly. They apply overwhelming force in the opening phase and destroy the enemy before the enemy adapts. Their 32 wars lasted an average of 11 months each. Decisive, efficient, overwhelming. She tapped the timeline again. Human wars rarely work that way. Several commanders nodded slowly. Human conflict had always been different. Long grinding. Adaptive. Wars where defeat did not necessarily mean the end. Wars where the losing side rebuilt, learned, and returned stronger than before. Wars where the early months were often disasters that somehow produced, years later, the innovations that changed the entire character of the conflict. The Vorkai doctrine assumes the enemy breaks, Chen continued. Economically, politically, militarily. In 11 months, under overwhelming force, most civilizations do break. Their governments collapse. Their populations lose the will to continue. She looked at the human timeline. But human governments have collapsed dozens of times in our history, and we kept fighting anyway. Human populations have lost the will to continue dozens of times, and we rebuilt. The concept of a war ending because one side simply stops being able to imagine continuing, we understand it intellectually, but it has never reliably applied to us. Okafor leaned back slightly in his chair and looked at the centuries of conflict hanging in the air above the table. Something in his expression was not pride. Something more complicated than that. Recognition, perhaps, of a pattern that had cost an enormous amount to build. "We've been practicing for this," he said quietly. Chen nodded. "For our entire history. Across human space, industry accelerated in ways the rest of the galaxy had never seen before. The orbital shipyards above Earth expanded their production schedules. Factories that normally produced civilian spacecraft began converting to military construction. Mining operations on asteroid colonies tripled their extraction quotas. Supply ships moved constantly between systems carrying metal, fuel, and manufactured components. The most dramatic changes occurred in the shipyards orbiting Luna. The yards had been designed during a previous era of human competition, when Earth's governments had feared each other more than any alien civilization. Massive rotating construction rings surrounding the moon, each capable of assembling starships hundreds of meters long. For decades they had been operating at partial capacity, ticking over on peacetime schedules. Within 2 weeks of the Concorde incident, they were running continuously. Lights burned across the shipyards 24 hours a day. Workers rotated through 12-hour shifts. Robotic assembly arms moved through vacuum like enormous mechanical spiders, welding armor plates and installing reactor cores inside half-finished hulls. New ship designs appeared almost weekly as engineers, running on pressure and urgency and the particular clarity that descends on a species when it has decided what it is doing next, produced a stream of innovations. Destroyers optimized for speed. Cruisers equipped with experimental weapon systems. Specialized vessels designed for electronic warfare and reconnaissance. Modular supply ships that could be reconfigured in days. Human engineers had always been very good at improving technology under pressure, or had always accelerated that quality. The colonies responded just as quickly. There were 42 human colony worlds spread across nearby sectors. They were culturally different, politically independent in many ways. Several of them had been arguing with Earth for years about trade regulations and taxation agreements. The Concorde recording ended those arguments almost immediately. Across the galaxy, alien intelligence networks began noticing something unusual. Human trade shipments had increased dramatically. Industrial production numbers were climbing. Ship construction orders were rising at a rate that did not match any normal economic pattern. At first, most analysts dismissed the changes. Humanity was reacting emotionally to a diplomatic insult. They would calm down eventually. But a few observers studied the numbers more carefully, and what they saw made them uncomfortable. Human military production was not rising slowly. It was accelerating, increasing at a rate that most galactic economies simply could not sustain. Every month, the numbers were larger than the month before. Not by a small margin, by significant ones. A young Vorkai intelligence officer named Skithvar spent 3 weeks studying the data. Among the Vorkai, she was considered unusually quiet. Her species valued aggression and confidence, but Skithvar had always preferred something different. Observation. She had a habit of sitting with uncomfortable conclusions longer than her colleagues, turning them over until she was sure she understood what she was looking at. When she finished her analysis, she submitted a report to Dominion High Command. The report contained a single conclusion. Humanity responds to pressure by increasing capability rather than reducing activity. She hesitated before writing the final line. Then she added it anyway. If current trends continue, the Dominion may have underestimated the strategic implications of this conflict. Her report was filed. It was read, and then it was placed in a secondary priority archive. Because the Vorkai Dominion had been winning wars for 600 years. And civilizations that win for that long sometimes forget an important truth. Victory teaches many lessons, but defeat teaches better ones. Humanity had learned a great many of those lessons, and the galaxy was about to discover what they meant. The war began quietly. There was no formal declaration, no speeches broadcast across the galaxy, no fleets gathering dramatically on the borders of contested space. Instead, 3 months after the incident at the Concorde, a small human convoy departed the colony system of Cardhose 9. The convoy consisted of 6 cargo ships and 2 escort frigates. On paper, it was routine traffic. The ships were carrying processed titanium or toward the inner human systems, where several shipyards were still hungry for raw materials. Their route took them through a narrow belt of asteroids known as the Kellier Drift. The region was well known to navigators. Thousands of irregular rocks floated there in unstable orbits, forming a slow-moving cloud of debris across several million kilometers of space. Travel through the drift was safe enough if ships followed the mapped navigation lanes. But outside those lanes, the terrain became chaotic. Sensors were unreliable. Line-of-sight weapons could be blocked by spinning rock formations. For most military commanders, the Kellier Drift was simply an inconvenient obstacle. For human planners, it was something else. It was terrain, and terrain had always mattered in human warfare. The convoy entered the asteroid field exactly on schedule. Their engines glowed faintly against the darkness as they followed the marked navigation path. Nothing about their movement looked unusual, which was precisely the point. 3 hours later, a Vorkai patrol group detected them. The patrol consisted of 4 Dominion cruisers conducting a routine sweep of nearby systems. Their mission was simple: observe human traffic, remind the younger species that the Dominion was watching. The Vorkai ships altered course and moved toward the convoy. Inside the lead cruiser, Commander Tarek studied the sensor display with mild interest. Human vessels, cargo transports, escorts, 2 light frigates. The commander made a low rumbling sound that the translation system rendered as amusement. Continue intercept. The Vorkai cruisers accelerated. They were larger than the human frigates, heavily armored, equipped with long-range plasma batteries capable of tearing through most civilian vessels in seconds. Within minutes, they closed the distance. The human convoy reacted exactly as expected. The cargo ships began increasing their speed. The 2 frigates moved into defensive positions, running, trying to escape. Tarek watched the display. Predictable. The Vorkai ships entered the outer edges of the asteroid field as they pursued the convoy. Their sensors flickered slightly as the surrounding rocks began interfering with targeting systems. Nothing serious, just background noise. The cruisers had operated in asteroid belts before. Their navigation systems were more than capable of handling the environment. The humans accelerated again. The gap between the 2 groups widened slightly, then narrowed again as the Vorkai cruisers increased power to their engines. Human convoy approaching dense asteroid cluster. Tarek nodded. They believe the terrain will slow us. And then the first asteroid exploded. Not a dramatic detonation, just a sudden bright flash of light followed by a shockwave of fragmented stone. The tactical display flickered. Commander, another asteroid detonated. Then another, and another. The explosions were not random. They were spreading, moving through the asteroid field like a chain reaction, each one placed with precision. The blasts not powerful enough to destroy ships, but absolutely sufficient for something else. Analysis. Explosive devices embedded in the asteroids, triggered by proximity sensors. Tarek's smile vanished. The human convoy suddenly changed course. Instead of fleeing deeper into the asteroid field, the cargo ships split into 2 groups and accelerated along narrow corridors between the rocks. The Vorkai cruisers attempted to follow, but the asteroid field around them was no longer stable. Hidden thrusters attached to dozens of the larger rocks activated simultaneously. Massive chunks of stone began shifting position, slowly at first, then faster. Entire sections of the asteroid field were moving, rearranging themselves, creating walls, blocking firing lines, closing the corridors that a pursuing fleet would naturally follow. The Vorkai sensor displays erupted in warning signals. "Commander," the tactical officer said sharply, "the asteroid field is being remotely manipulated." Tarek stared at the screen. The humans had turned the terrain itself into a weapon. More explosions rippled through the surrounding rocks, not powerful enough to destroy the cruisers outright, but powerful enough to scatter debris across their sensor arrays and weapon targeting systems. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Then the human frigates attacked. They emerged suddenly from behind a rotating asteroid cluster, their engines burning bright as they accelerated straight toward the Vorkai formation. Their weapons opened fire, not at the cruisers themselves, not at hulls or reactors or fuel lines, at the sensor dishes, communication arrays, engine control surfaces. Precise, focused, deliberate. They were not trying to destroy the ships. They were trying to blind them, deafen them, and strand them. The frigates fired, turned sharply, and disappeared again into the maze of drifting stone before the Vorkai gunners could lock onto them. Forward sensors offline. Communications disrupted. Debris impact on engine housing. Tarek slammed one of his heavy limbs against the command console. Return fire. But there was nothing to target. The human ships appeared for seconds at a time, fired quick bursts, then vanished again behind shifting walls of asteroid debris. The battlefield itself was moving, changing constantly. The Vorkai cruisers were powerful warships designed for direct confrontation. They had never been built for this kind of fight. The ambush lasted 9 minutes. When it ended, the human convoy was gone. The 2 frigates had vanished into deeper sections of the asteroid field, and the 4 Vorkai cruisers drifted slowly among the scattered debris. Damaged, blinded, alive, but humiliated. The first battle of the war had ended, and the Dominion had not managed to fire a single effective shot. The official report describing the Kellier Drift incident reached Vorkai Dominion High Command 31 hours after the damaged cruisers limped back to the nearest military outpost. At first glance, the report looked strange. For Dominion cruisers had engaged what appeared to be a small human cargo convoy. No ships had been destroyed. No lives had been lost. Yet the tactical summary described the event as a combat failure. Inside the Dominion intelligence complex orbiting the world Karvek, Skithvar sat alone reviewing the data. She replayed the combat recording again. The moment when the asteroids began exploding appeared on the screen. Her golden eyes narrowed slightly. The explosions had not been powerful. The mines embedded in the rocks had been small, almost delicate compared to the weapons normally used in Dominion fleet engagements. That was what made the tactics so strange. They were not designed to destroy ships. They were designed to shape the battlefield. She advanced the recording. The drifting asteroids shifted position. Hidden thrusters fired. Walls of rock formed around the cruisers. Then the human frigates appeared. Fast, precise, targeting sensors and communication arrays and engine surfaces. Not hulls, not reactors. The frigates fired, then withdrew. They had deliberately avoided destroying the cruisers. Skithvar paused the recording. That detail bothered her the most. Dominion strategy had always been simple. When fighting an enemy fleet, destroy it. End the battle quickly. Crush resistance before the enemy can adapt. But the humans had done something different. They had demonstrated a capability, then left. She opened the Dominion's intelligence archive on human history. It was an enormous file, thousands of years of recorded conflicts. She scrolled through the entries. War after war, civil wars, continental wars, planetary wars, coalitions, revolutions, entire political systems rising and collapsing again. For a moment, she wondered how a species that violent had survived long enough to reach the stars. Then she noticed something else. Patterns. Human wars rarely ended quickly. In many cases, the early phases had gone badly for one side. Defeats, lost territory, disasters. But the wars continued. And something happened during that time. The losing side adapted. New weapons appeared. New tactics. New alliances. Human conflicts often lasted years. Sometimes decades. Sometimes longer. And the longer they lasted, the more complicated they became. The more capable the survivors became, the more the initial disadvantage eroded. Skithvar leaned back slightly. She opened the Kellier Drift combat recording again. This time she watched the Vorkai cruisers. Their behavior was predictable. Direct pursuit. Aggressive advance. Overwhelming firepower. Standard Dominion doctrine. She compared that doctrine to the human response. Preparation. Terrain manipulation. Ambush. Mobility. Psychological messaging. The humans had not fought the battle to win. They had fought it to teach. She felt an uncomfortable sensation forming in her chest. She began writing a report. The words came slowly at first, then faster. Preliminary analysis of human combat doctrine suggests a strategic framework fundamentally different from Dominion operational models. Humans appear to treat early engagements as information-gathering opportunities rather than decisive conflicts. Their tactics emphasize adaptation, environmental manipulation, and incremental capability improvement. She hesitated before writing the final section. It was not a comfortable conclusion, but it matched the evidence. If this interpretation is correct, human military effectiveness will likely increase over time during any sustained conflict. She added one final line. Dominion doctrine relies heavily on rapid victory. Human doctrine appears optimized for long wars. She stared at the words for several seconds. Then she transmitted the report to Dominion High Command. Hours later, deep within the Vorkai Command Citadel, an older strategist skimmed the document. He read the opening paragraphs. He reached the conclusion. He considered it for a few moments with the mild skepticism of someone reviewing a report that did not match 6 centuries of institutional memory. Then he closed the file. The Dominion had fought 32 wars. They had won all of them. The idea that a small, newly arrived species might somehow benefit from prolonged conflict seemed unlikely. The report was archived. Low priority. But in another part of the galaxy, Counselor Thek of the Meath Engineering Union had also been studying the Kellier Drift incident. When he finished reviewing the battle footage, he sent a message to his government. The message was short. Humans are not testing their enemy. They are testing themselves. He stared out the window of his office at the distant stars for a long moment. If I am correct, he added, the Dominion has already lost something important. He hesitated. Then he finished the message. They simply do not know it yet. The Dominion did not respond to the Kellier Drift incident immediately. For a civilization that had dominated its region of the galaxy for 6 centuries, the loss of 4 damaged cruisers was not a crisis. It was an irritation, a minor embarrassment caused by a younger species attempting to prove something. But irritation had consequences. 3 weeks after the asteroid ambush, the Vorkai Dominion launched what it considered a corrective action. A fleet of 22 warships entered the outer human colony system of Ardenfall. Ardenfall was not an important world. It was a mining colony. Population, 2 million. Its surface covered in frozen oceans and jagged mountains. Its only real value the network of orbital refineries that processed rare metals extracted from the planet's crust. The Dominion fleet expected the colony to surrender. That was how these operations normally worked. When a larger military power arrived over a weaker world, the defending government made a sensible decision. They lowered their weapons. They accepted occupation. The Vorkai had seen it happen dozens of times. The governor received the Dominion transmission as the fleet emerged from hyperspace. The message was brief. Human colony Ardenfall. You are now under Dominion authority. Deactivate all orbital defenses. Prepare for inspection. Governor Yusuf Patel read the message twice. He set down his tablet. He stood up from his desk and walked to the window of his office. Through the reinforced glass, he could see the frozen horizon of the planet stretching in every direction. The great jagged mountain ridges that had been his view for 7 years of colonial administration, now framed above by the dark metallic shapes of 22 Dominion warships floating in formation like a storm that was not yet falling. He thought about his 2 million people. The refinery workers and the deep drill teams and the engineers who kept the atmospheric processors running, and the children in the habitat schools who had not yet been told what was parked above their sky. He thought about a recording he had watched 3 times in the past month, of a terminal being crushed in a chamber far away and a word being spoken with perfect calm across the stars. He thought about Governor Alexander Kowalczyk on New Warsaw, who had transmitted him a private message 2 weeks ago. Not official, just one colonial governor to another. The message had said, whatever comes, don't let them take it without a cost. They need to understand that every world matters. Patel looked at the fleet above his horizon. Then he pressed the colony-wide broadcast button. Attention Ardenfall citizens. This is Governor Patel. He kept his voice calm. That mattered. If the governor was calm, the people would be calmer. He had learned that in 7 years. There appears to be some confusion. We are not surrendering. He released the button. He sat back down at his desk. He opened the Emergency Defense Command interface and began issuing orders. The opening bombardment began 20 minutes later. Plasma artillery from the Dominion cruisers fired downward toward the orbital defense platforms circling the planet. The human platforms responded immediately. Railgun batteries thundered across space. Missile swarms erupted from hidden launch tubes embedded inside the colony's refinery stations, and the sky above Ardenfall became a storm of light. The Dominion fleet expected the battle to last minutes. Instead, it lasted 6 hours. The human defenses were destroyed eventually. The Dominion had simply brought too much firepower, and physics did not care about courage. But every defense platform had continued firing until the moment it broke apart. Every missile battery had launched its full arsenal. The colony's defenders made the fleet earn every kilometer of space above the planet, and several Dominion ships left the battle carrying damage that would take weeks to repair. The colony fell. Governor Patel was taken into Dominion custody when ground forces arrived at the administration complex. He did not resist. He had done what he set out to do, made them pay a price for it, ensured they understood that this world was not simply handed over. The fleet commander filed a report describing the engagement as successful, but noting the unexpectedly sustained resistance. Ardenfall was only the beginning. Over the next 6 months, the Dominion launched similar operations against 4 more human colonies: Kestrel Prime, New Warsaw, Horizon Station, Atlas Outpost. Each time the pattern repeated, Dominion fleets arrived expecting rapid victories. And they won them, eventually. But every battle lasted longer than predicted. Human defenses appeared in unexpected places. Hidden weapons platforms, minefields disguised as civilian infrastructure, mobile fighter squadrons emerging from underground hangars built months before the war began, during the quiet period when the galaxy was watching humanity's silence and calling it surrender. Human ships rarely fought to the last vessel. Instead, they withdrew once their objectives were complete, delaying, harassing, damaging Dominion formations before retreating deeper into human territory, forcing the fleet to clear the same ground twice. The war was spreading, and it was becoming messy. Inside the Dominion command structure, irritation was slowly turning into frustration. Wars were supposed to have clear stages: invasion, battle, victory, occupation. But the human conflict refused to follow that structure. Every conquered system seemed to slow the Dominion advance rather than accelerate it. Supply convoys began experiencing strange accidents. Asteroid mining facilities exploded without warning. Navigation beacons malfunctioned, sending Dominion patrol ships drifting into uncharted debris fields. At first, these incidents appeared unrelated, random, but Dominion intelligence eventually discovered the truth. Human ships were everywhere. Small, fast, difficult to track. They attacked supply lines, communication relays, fuel depots, never staying long enough for the Dominion fleets to catch them. One Dominion officer described the experience during a strategy meeting. "It is like fighting smoke. You reach for it, and it disappears." Meanwhile, human production continued rising. The shipyards above Luna were now producing warships at 3 times their previous capacity. New fleets were forming faster than Dominion analysts believed possible, and the humans were not fighting alone anymore. Quietly, other species had begun to help. Not openly. Not yet. But small things were happening. The Meath Engineering Union began selling navigation equipment to human traders at unusually favorable prices. The Cerity Collective allowed human cargo ships to refuel in their territory without inspection. Several smaller civilizations started sharing sensor data with human fleets. None of these actions violated Concord law, but together they formed a pattern, a quiet network of support growing around humanity, built from a simple recognition that had been spreading since the day Vraxen crushed that terminal. Many species in the galaxy had watched that moment, had heard the word prey, and some of them had begun wondering whether the Dominion had, for the first time in 6 centuries, chosen the wrong species to test that word against. 1 year after the war began, a Dominion strike force arrived at the human colony New Warsaw, expecting another quick victory. Instead, they found something they had never seen before: a human fleet waiting for them. Not hiding, not retreating, waiting. 28 human warships floated above the planet in a defensive formation. Their hulls were new, fresh from the Luna shipyards, carrying a year's worth of improvements and innovations and lessons learned from every ambush and skirmish and retreating engagement that had come before. Their engines glowed brightly in the darkness. Behind them, the planet's orbital defenses hummed with power. The Dominion fleet commander studied the sensor display. His tactical officer confirmed the reading. The commander made a low rumbling sound of satisfaction. Finally, this was the kind of fight the Dominion understood. Overwhelming force against a smaller opponent. Direct confrontation. The kind of battle that ended wars quickly. The Dominion fleet advanced. Weapons charging. Formation tightening. Across the void, the human fleet held position. Inside the human flagship, Admiral Chen Xiaolian watched the Dominion ships approach. Her officers waited quietly around her. After a moment, she spoke. "Signal the outer squadrons. Far beyond the immediate battlefield, in the shadows of nearby moons and asteroid clusters where they had been waiting dark and cold and invisible to Dominion sensors, dozens of small human strike craft activated their engines. They began accelerating toward the approaching fleet. Admiral Chen studied the tactical display calmly. For the first time since the war began, humanity was not delaying, not retreating, not harassing supply lines from a distance. This time they were ready to fight, and the Dominion had just walked directly into the center of the trap. The Battle of New Warsaw lasted 14 hours. For the Dominion fleet, it was supposed to be the moment the war ended. Instead, it became the moment the war changed. The opening exchange shattered Dominion expectations almost immediately. As their formation advanced toward the human fleet above the planet, their sensors suddenly filled with new contacts. Dozens of small human strike craft emerged from the shadows of nearby moons and drifting asteroid fragments, fast, lightly armored, but heavily armed, moving like swarms of insects before the larger warships could bring their main weapons to bear. Missiles streaked through the darkness. Railgun rounds hammered against Dominion hull plating. Human ships were not trying to destroy the enemy fleet in one massive strike. They were dismantling it. Engine clusters, sensor towers, weapon targeting systems. The Dominion ships fought back with overwhelming power. Plasma batteries carved glowing scars across human hulls. Several human frigates exploded during the first hour of combat. But every time a human ship was destroyed, two more seemed to appear from somewhere beyond the battlefield. Reinforcements arriving from hidden jump points, fresh vessels launched from distant shipyards, new fighters descending from orbital platforms that had been building their reserves for months. The Dominion fleet had expected a single defensive line. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by layers of moving targets, all of them adapting in real time, none of them behaving the way a losing fleet was supposed to behave. Hours passed. The battle dragged on, and slowly, something unfamiliar began spreading through the Dominion command channels. Uncertainty. Not fear. Not yet. But confusion. Human fleets were supposed to retreat. Instead, they kept returning. Damaged ships withdrew only to reappear hours later after battlefield repairs. Strike craft landed briefly on New Warsaw's orbital platforms before launching again. The planet itself had become part of the defense network, a base, a repair yard, a launching point, something that refused to be separated from the fleet defending it. At the center of the human formation, Admiral Chun watched the battle unfold with quiet focus. Her fleet was taking losses, heavy ones, but that had always been part of the plan. Human war doctrine did not require perfect victories, only survivable ones. Late in the 12th hour of combat, something unexpected happened. A new transmission appeared on every communication channel across the battlefield, not from a warship, from the surface of New Warsaw. The broadcast signal expanded outward through the Concord communication network, reaching dozens of nearby star systems in a spreading wave. The message came from the planet's civilian governor. His voice was calm, tired, but steady. "This is Governor Alexander Kowalczyk of New Warsaw. I am speaking to every civilization listening to this conflict." Behind his voice, the distant thunder of orbital weapons echoed faintly through the transmission. "We know many of you are watching. We know some of you are afraid." He paused for a moment. 3 years ago, in the Concord chamber, humanity was called prey. Some of you said nothing. We understand why. The message continued spreading across the galaxy, into trade stations and government offices and military command centers, across hundreds of listening posts in dozens of systems. In the Concord Assembly Chamber, delegates stopped what they were doing and watched it play across their displays. Some of them had been in that chamber on the day Vraxen crushed the terminal. They remembered saying nothing. They remembered looking at their consoles. Now they watched a small human colony fighting a fleet many times its size, and refusing to stop. "Today the Dominion fleet has come to claim this world," the governor continued. "We could surrender. It would save lives." His voice hardened slightly. But surrender would also prove that the Dominion was right, that the strong rule and the weak obey, that some species exist to be conquered and some exist to conquer, and that the line between them is fixed and permanent and can never be crossed. A long silence. The background noise of battle grew louder. Human fighters streaked past the camera feed, transmitting the message. Humanity has fought itself for most of its history. Terrible wars. Ugly wars. Wars we are not proud of. But from those wars, from all of that loss and destruction and rebuilding, we learned something. He paused. We learned that power alone does not create a civilization. Choice does. Every species in this galaxy has made choices about what kind of civilization it wants to be. Some have chosen fear. Some have chosen silence. Some have chosen to become exactly what was done to them. Another pause. Today we choose something simple. No species in this galaxy should ever again be called prey. The transmission ended. For several minutes after the message finished, no one in the galaxy spoke. In the Concord Assembly Chamber, hundreds of delegates sat in stunned silence watching the broadcast replay across their displays. Some of them remembered the day of the terminal. They had been in that room. They had watched Fraxon crush it. They had heard the word. And they had said nothing. Now they watched New Warsaw. In the Meath Engineering Union delegation tier, Councillor Thek leaned slowly back in his seat. He had sent his government 2 messages in the past year, both of them cautious. Both of them hedged with the careful language of a diplomat who had spent 61 years learning how to say alarming things without alarming anyone prematurely. This time, when he opened his console, he did not hedge. The message was 3 words. They are ready. Around him, other delegates began moving. A representative from the Cerity Collective activated her console and opened a secure communication channel to her government. Her message contained a single request: authorize humanitarian aid shipments to human systems. Moments later, the Falari Cooperative Delegation did the same. Then the Thaline Republic. Then several civilizations that had once been absorbed into the Dominion quietly began transmitting sensor data to human fleets. Not declarations, not alliances, just information flowing in a new direction. None of these actions were formal declarations of support, but the balance of the war had begun to shift. In the Vorkai Command flagship above New Warsaw, the Dominion Fleet commander watched the broadcast replay on his screen. He did not understand it. To the Dominion mind, the concept was illogical. Wars were fought for territory, resources, power, not ideals. You did not broadcast messages to the galaxy while your orbital platforms were being destroyed. You fought or you surrendered. Those were the options. He turned the display off. Continue the assault, he ordered. But far beyond the battlefield, something had already changed. Not on the tactical display. In the space between civilizations where politics lives. In the quiet calculations of species that had been watching and waiting and deciding whose side they were on. Because wars are not fought only with weapons. Sometimes they are fought with stories. And the story of this war had just spread across the entire galaxy. The Dominion had called humanity prey. Now the galaxy was beginning to wonder whether the Dominion had chosen the wrong species to test that belief. The war lasted 3 years. For the Vorkai Dominion, it became the longest conflict in their recorded history. No previous enemy had ever forced them into a struggle measured in years instead of weeks. Human fleets never stopped moving. When Dominion forces pushed into human territory, they were slowed by mines, ambushes, and disappearing strike groups. When the Dominion attempted to regroup, their supply convoys vanished into drifting debris fields or arrived damaged after long journeys through disrupted navigation routes. And every month the human fleets grew larger. Shipyards that once built dozens of vessels per year were now producing hundreds. Colonies that had begun the war defending themselves were now launching their own strike groups into Dominion-controlled systems. The conflict had expanded beyond any shape the Dominion strategists had predicted. Not a brief punitive action against a minor species, but a sprawling multi-front war that demanded resources from every corner of the Dominion's territory simultaneously. The war did not end with a single decisive battle. It ended with exhaustion. Dominion territory had not collapsed. Their fleets were still powerful, but they were bleeding resources across dozens of fronts, fighting an enemy that refused to behave like any civilization they had ever conquered. One that grew stronger under pressure rather than weaker, that treated every setback as information, that seemed to have an institutional memory for this kind of prolonged, grinding, adaptive conflict that no intelligence report had fully captured. 3 years of war had changed the strategic map of the region, and more importantly, it had changed the political map. Across the Concord, smaller civilizations had slowly begun aligning themselves with humanity. Trade agreements shifted. Intelligence networks shared information. Neutral systems quietly closed their borders to Dominion fleets. The Vorkai had spent 6 centuries ruling through fear. Now that fear was fading, not because the Dominion had become less powerful, but because humanity had demonstrated that power could be resisted. That the cost of resistance, while terrible, was survivable. That a species with enough history of fighting itself carries a certain immunity to the despair that breaks other civilizations. The associated members had watched New Warsaw. They had heard Governor Kowalczyk's voice. And quietly, in small ways that were individually deniable and collectively unmistakable, they had begun to remember what it felt like to make choices. When the peace negotiations finally began, they took place in the same chamber where the conflict had started. The Helios Concord Assembly Hall. Hundreds of delegates filled the seats. Some of them had watched the first insult years earlier. Others had joined the council since then, drawn by the growing importance of the conflict. The chamber felt different now, not the comfortable stillness of a room that had settled into its habits, but something more alive, more uncertain, more aware of itself. At the center platform stood 2 representatives. Ambassador Elena Voss, and across from her, the aging Dominion diplomat Vraxen. Time had changed him. The ridges of his armored skin were deeper now. His movements were slower. The war had taken its toll in the way that long campaigns take tolls, not in one dramatic moment, but in the gradual weight of years, of decisions made under pressure, of battles that ended differently than expected. Voss looked almost the same as she had on the day he crushed the terminal. Calm, composed, watching. The Concord moderator spoke first. The Assembly recognizes the conclusion of hostilities between the Human Alliance and the Vorkai Dominion. The terms of peace will now be presented. Vraxen spoke before the moderator could continue. His deep voice filled the chamber once again. The same voice that had interrupted Voss's introduction 3 years earlier. The same voice that had spoken a single word and set the war in motion. "You have fought well," he said. It was the closest the Dominion had ever come to an admission of respect. Voss inclined her head slightly. Humanity did not begin this conflict. Vraxen's golden eyes flickered briefly. "No," he admitted. "You did not." For a moment the chamber was silent, not the tense silence of that first day, but something different. The silence of a room that was listening carefully because it understood the weight of what was happening. Voss activated the central display. A star map appeared above the assembly, dozens of systems glowing softly across the projection. "These are the worlds currently under Dominion authority," she said. "They will be given a choice: full independence, or continued association with the Dominion under revised Concord oversight, with protections for local governance that the Dominion cannot override." A ripple of surprise moved through the chamber. This was not a demand for conquest. It was not a demand for territory or resources or military advantage. It was a demand for freedom, for the associated members watching from their tiers, for the civilizations that had spent decades casting votes they hadn't chosen, for every species that had heard the word subjects and understood what it meant. Vraxen studied the map for a long moment. "You do not claim them for yourselves?" Voss shook her head. That was never the point. She looked slowly around the chamber, meeting the eyes of dozens of alien representatives. The associated members, the neutral powers, the small civilizations in the outer tiers who had spent years watching from the edges of the room where gravity was weakest. "Humanity is not interested in replacing one empire with another," she said. She paused. "Only in ending one." The moderator allowed the quiet to stretch for several seconds before speaking again. "The second condition?" Voss returned her gaze to Vraxen. "No civilization within Concord territory will ever again be classified as prey." The word hung in the chamber. The same word that had started everything. Now returned, not as a declaration, but as a boundary. Not spoken in contempt, but in resolution, a line drawn in the records of the galaxy that could not be undrawn. Vraxen looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, the massive Vorkai diplomat lowered his head. The gesture was subtle, but everyone in the chamber understood what it meant. Acknowledgement. The Dominion accepted the terms. Across the assembly chamber, hundreds of species watched the moment history shifted. 3 years earlier, humanity had entered the Concord as a minor power. A young species from a single world, seated near the edges of the room, barely considered relevant. The kind of civilization that the galaxy assumed would eventually learn to be quiet, to adapt, to find its place in the order of things and stay there. They had changed the rules instead. In the upper tiers, Councillor Thek of the Meath Engineering Union sat quietly for a long time after the negotiation concluded. Around him, delegates were already moving, opening communication channels, drafting messages, beginning the long process of reshaping alliances and agreements in the wake of a war that had rearranged the political map of the region. He did not move immediately. He sat and looked at the center platform, where Voss was gathering her materials with the same calm efficiency he had first noticed in her 3 years ago, when he had watched her walk back from the speaker's platform after Vraxen's insult, and thought, that is not the walk of someone who is afraid. He had sent many messages to his government over the past 3 years. Cautious ones, analytical ones, ones that described what humanity was doing in the careful language of an observer trying to remain neutral. He opened his console now and composed one more. I have spent 61 years in this chamber, he wrote, watching the same gravity pull everything toward the same center. I do not know yet what humanity will do with what they have built, but I know what they have already done. They came to this room as the smallest voice in it, and they left having changed what the room is. He paused, then added a final line. That is not something I expected to see in my lifetime. Ambassador Voss left the chamber through the same corridor she had walked every day for 3 years. The station was familiar to her now in the way that places become familiar when you have spent enough time paying attention to them. The particular quality of the recycled air in the outer ring, the sound of different atmospheric systems cycling in the species-specific zones, the way the lighting shifted slightly in the hours that corresponded to morning by whatever clock you were running on. She had not expected to be here this long. She had not expected any of it, really. Not the terminal, not the silence, not the war, not standing on a platform in front of the most powerful assembly in the known galaxy and watching the Dominion lower its head. She had expected, when she arrived 3 years ago, to spend a few years watching and learning and finding her footing in a room where humanity barely registered. She had expected the slow, patient work of building relationships, small incremental gains, the kind of diplomacy that takes decades. Instead, history had moved quickly. She paused at the observation window at the end of the corridor. Outside, the star that the station circled burned quietly in the darkness, small and white and belonging to no one. Neutral ground, neutral law, neutral council. The dream of 3 centuries, imperfect and complicated and still somehow standing. Behind her, in the chamber, the work of implementing the peace terms was already beginning. Systems being reclassified, governments being reorganized. The long, slow process of changing what had been true for 6 centuries. She stood at the window for a moment, thinking about the Falari diplomat who had stopped mid-sentence when a Vorkai leaned forward. About the miners on Sedna who had stood up from their chairs. About New Warsaw. About what the word prey sounded like when it crossed the galaxy. About what it sounded like now. The war was over. But civilizations that survive long wars often become something different afterward. Stronger, wiser, more certain of what they are willing to defend and what they are willing to become. The galaxy was beginning to understand something about humanity that no intelligence report had fully captured. Humans did not like war, but when it was necessary, they were very, very good at it. And once they finished one, they tended to remember the lessons for a very long time. Voss turned from the window and walked back toward the human delegation offices. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do.